Before anyone spoke of resurrection, before the empty tomb, before dawn broke over Jerusalem on the third day, something happened that shook the world in a way no one could ignore. The sky grew dark in the middle of the day. The earth trembled beneath men's feet. Stones split, tombs opened, and at the center of it all stood a cross. This was not the death of an ordinary man, and creation itself seemed unwilling to remain silent. From noon until mid-afternoon, darkness covered the land as though heaven had drawn a veil over the suffering unfolding at Golgotha. Then, in the midst of that terrible silence, Jesus cried out and yielded his spirit. At that very moment, events began to unfold with such force, such meaning, and such precision that those who witnessed them would never be the same again. Priests in the temple, soldiers at the hill, mourners in the city, and families near the tombs all found themselves caught inside a moment larger than history itself. It was as if the heavens, the earth, and even death were bearing witness to what had just taken place. What happened in those hours was not random. It was not merely tragic. It was the fulfillment of something long promised, long prepared, and long awaited. And when the final sign came, it did not come from the sky or the ground, but from the lips of a Roman soldier standing before the cross. The events of that day unfolded during one of the most significant times in the Jewish calendar, the Feast of Passover. This annual celebration commemorated Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, when God spared his people through the blood of a lamb. For centuries, Jewish families had gathered in Jerusalem to remember that act of salvation, and by the first century, the city would swell with pilgrims from across the Roman world. Jerusalem itself stood under Roman occupation. Though the Jews were allowed to maintain their religious practices, they lived under the authority of Rome, a power that enforced order through strength and public displays of control. Crucifixion was one such display, a method of execution reserved for rebels and criminals, carried out in visible places to serve as a warning to others. Just outside the city walls lay Golgotha, often called the place of the skull. It was there that condemned men were crucified, exposed to the sight of passers-by. On that particular Passover, 3 men hung on crosses, and among them was Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher known throughout the region for his words, his works, and the growing belief among many that he was the promised Messiah. At the same time, within the temple in Jerusalem, priests continued their daily duties. Central to their worship was the system of sacrifices established in the law of Moses. Every morning and every evening, a lamb was offered on the altar as part of the continual sacrifice. During Passover, these rituals carried even deeper meaning, as families brought lambs to be sacrificed in remembrance of God's deliverance. The temple itself was divided into sacred spaces. At its heart was the most holy place, separated by a great veil. This veil symbolized the boundary between God's holy presence and humanity. Only the high priest could enter beyond it, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. All of these elements, the Roman authority, the Passover celebration, the temple sacrifices, and the deep expectations surrounding the Messiah, form the setting in which the events of that day took place. It was a moment where history, faith, and divine purpose converged. At the center of this moment stood Jesus of Nazareth. To some, he was a teacher who spoke with authority unlike any other. To others, he was a healer who restored sight to the blind and strength to the broken. Many had followed him, listening to his teachings about the kingdom of God, witnessing his compassion, and wondering if he might truly be the one promised in the scriptures, the Messiah who would come to save his people. Yet not everyone received him with faith. The religious leaders, chief priests, scribes, and Pharisees, saw him as a threat. His words challenged their authority, and his actions stirred the people. They feared that his influence might disrupt both their position and the fragile peace with Rome. In the days leading up to Passover, they resolved that he must be removed. Then there was Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. His responsibility was to maintain order in Jerusalem, especially during festivals when tensions ran high. Though he found no clear fault in Jesus, he ultimately yielded to the pressure of the crowd and authorized the crucifixion. Among those present at Golgotha were Roman soldiers, men trained for discipline and execution. For them, this was not a moment of spiritual significance, but a routine duty. They carried out their orders with efficiency, accustomed to the suffering before them. Nearby stood a smaller group, those who had followed Jesus closely. Among them were women who had supported his ministry, watching from a distance in grief. His disciples, once bold in their devotion, were scattered and afraid, uncertain of what would come next. And within the city, the priests continued their service in the temple, unaware that events unfolding outside its walls would soon challenge everything they had known. Each of these individuals, leaders, soldiers, followers, and observers, stood in different places, both physically and spiritually. Yet all of them were about to witness something that would confront their understanding, their beliefs, and their place in the story of God's work among his people. It was about noon when the first sign appeared. The sun, which had stood high over Jerusalem, suddenly gave way to darkness. This was no passing cloud or brief shadow. A deep and unbroken darkness settled over the land and remained for hours. Those gathered at Golgotha could no longer see clearly what stood before them. Conversations quieted, movements slowed. Something was happening that no one could explain. Jesus had already endured hours on the cross. The weight of suffering, both physical and spiritual, pressed upon him, and in the midst of that darkness, he cried out with a loud voice. Those nearby heard his words, though not all understood them. Some stood in confusion, others in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. As the hours passed, the tension grew. Then near the ninth hour, Jesus spoke again. This time his words carried a sense of completion. He entrusted his spirit into the hands of the Father and bowed his head. With that final breath, his life came to an end. At that very moment, events began to unfold beyond the hill of Golgotha. Inside the temple, where priests carried out their sacred duties, something extraordinary occurred. The great veil that separated the most holy place from the rest of the temple was torn in two. It was not torn from the bottom, as if by human hands, but from top to bottom, as though the separation itself had been removed by a power beyond human reach. Simultaneously, the earth began to shake. The ground beneath Jerusalem trembled with force. Rocks split apart, and the stability of the land itself seemed to give way. Those standing near the cross felt it beneath their feet. Those within the city felt it within their walls. Fear spread quickly, for this was no ordinary disturbance. The effects of the earthquake reached even further. Tombs carved into the hillside surrounding Jerusalem were open. Stones that had sealed them were moved, exposing what lay within. The resting places of the dead were no longer closed. Though the bodies remained within at that moment, the sight itself was unsettling, as if something long sealed had been disturbed. Meanwhile, back at the cross, Roman soldiers continued their duties. It was customary to hasten the death of those crucified by breaking their legs, preventing them from lifting themselves to breathe. The soldiers approached the men crucified alongside Jesus and carried out this act. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. To confirm this, one of the soldiers took a spear and pierced his side. Immediately, blood and water flowed out. The soldier likely did not understand the significance of what he had done. He acted according to his role, ensuring that death had truly occurred. All these events unfolded within a short span of time. Darkness in the sky, the final words of Jesus, the tearing of the veil, the trembling of the earth, the splitting of rocks, the opening of tombs, and the piercing of his side. Each moment followed the next with increasing intensity, forming a sequence that none present could fully comprehend. Those who witnessed these things were left to process what they had seen. Some were afraid, some were confused. Others began to wonder if what had taken place carried a meaning far greater than they had first believed. As the earth continued to tremble and the signs unfolded around them, the moment reached its most intense point, not in the sky, nor in the temple, nor even in the open tombs, but in the response of those standing closest to the cross. Among them was a Roman centurion, a man trained for war and hardened by countless executions. Crucifixion was not new to him. He had seen suffering before, heard cries of pain, and watched many die. Yet this moment was different. The darkness, the earthquake, the manner in which Jesus had spoken and died, these things did not fit what he knew. He stood facing the cross, observing everything carefully. He had witnessed the calm with which Jesus endured his suffering, the words he spoke, and the way he entrusted his spirit at the end. This was not the death of a man defeated by fear or desperation. There was a sense of purpose, even in his final breath. Then as the ground shook beneath him and the events around him unfolded, something changed within the centurion. The signs were no longer just external occurrences. They began to form a realization. What he had just witnessed could not be explained by ordinary means. In that moment, he spoke words that carried great weight. Truly, this was the Son of God. This declaration did not come from a scholar of the law or a priest within the temple. It came from a Gentile soldier, an outsider to the promises of Israel. Yet it was spoken at the very moment when the significance of the cross began to be revealed. Around him, others were also affected. The crowd that had gathered, many of whom had earlier called for Jesus to be crucified, now began to respond with sorrow and unease. They struck their chests in grief, recognizing that something profound and perhaps terrible had taken place. This was the turning point. The events had reached their highest tension, and in this moment, the meaning of what had occurred began to emerge, not only through signs in creation, but through the recognition within the human heart. After the trembling ceased and the darkness lifted, a heavy stillness settled over the land. The events that had unfolded left a deep impression on all who had witnessed them. Yet outwardly, life began to return to its familiar patterns. The crosses remained. The bodies were taken down. The day moved toward its close. Jesus' body was given to Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council who had not agreed with the decision against him. With care and reverence, he placed Jesus in a new tomb carved out of rock. A large stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing it. The work was done quickly as the Sabbath was approaching, a day of rest strictly observed according to the law. The women who had followed Jesus watched where he was laid. They intended to return after the Sabbath to complete the burial preparations. Their hearts were filled with grief, for to them the story had ended in loss. Meanwhile, the chief priests and Pharisees remembered something that others had not fully grasped. They recalled that Jesus had spoken of rising after 3 days. Concerned that his followers might take his body and claim such a thing had happened, they went to Pilate and requested that the tomb be secured. Pilate granted their request. A guard was set, and the stone was sealed with official authority. From every human perspective, the situation was final. The tomb was closed. The body was inside. The watch was set. And so, the day after these extraordinary events passed in silence. No further signs appeared. No voices were raised. It was as though the world, having been shaken so deeply, now paused, waiting, though no one yet understood for what. The events surrounding the death of Jesus reveal more than a sequence of extraordinary signs. They point to a deeper truth about God's purpose in his relationship with humanity. Each moment, the darkness, the torn veil, the trembling earth, invites reflection on what was truly taking place. The darkness that covered the land reminds us of the weight of sin and the seriousness of separation from God. Yet it was not a final darkness, for it did not remain. It passed, suggesting that what was happening, though heavy and painful, was part of a greater work. The tearing of the temple veil carries profound meaning. For generations, that veil had symbolized distance between God and his people. Its sudden division at the moment of Jesus' death points to a new reality, that access to God was no longer restricted in the same way. Through this event, a way was opened, not through repeated sacrifices, but through a single act. The response of the centurion reminds us that understanding does not always come from knowledge alone. Sometimes it comes through witnessing, through reflection, and through a moment when truth becomes clear in the heart. Together, these events suggest that the death of Jesus was not the end of a story, but the fulfillment of a purpose. It reveals a God who acts within history, who provides a way for restoration, and who invites people, regardless of background, to recognize and respond. The events of that day continue to speak beyond their historical setting. They invite us to consider how we respond when faced with moments that challenge our understanding and stir something deeper within us. The centurion did not begin with belief, yet what he witnessed led him to recognize truth. In a similar way, people today often find themselves searching, questioning, or observing before arriving at faith. This story reminds us that understanding can grow through reflection and openness. The tearing of the veil points to the idea that access to God is no longer distant or limited. It encourages us to approach him with honesty, bringing both our struggles and our hopes. It suggests that faith is not reserved for a few, but offered to all who seek. The stillness that followed those events also carries meaning. There are moments in life when answers are not immediate, when circumstances feel uncertain, and when we are left waiting. Yet even in silence, there may be purpose unfolding beyond what we can see. This story invites each person to reflect. How do we respond when we encounter truth, when we face questions of faith, or when life presents moments that seem beyond explanation? It encourages a posture of humility, openness, and trust, recognizing that even in the most difficult moments, there may be a greater purpose at work.